Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche decides to tackle the idea of free will. And I've actually made a video explaining his position on free will, because it's quite interesting. But he starts by saying that the act of willing is above all something complicated. It's not a simple matter. And I mention this merely to say that I agree that willing is something complicated, and so we should treat it like something complicated. And so when we discuss the idea of free will, we all need to be on the same page about what it is we're actually talking about. And I'll say this at the start. I plan to discuss this a little bit down the line, but I think philosophers like Sam Harris make the error of equating free will with like literal omnipotence. So again, I need to restate that the purpose of me defining free will is to avoid making the error of defining free will in such a way that it's just a natural consequence of the axioms that I put forth. I want to define free will in a systematic way, but also in a way in which everybody agrees that pretty much constitutes free will. It's like if I were to argue for the existence of God, and I start by defining God as the universe itself. That's an interesting idea, but that's not usually what people mean by God. So my choice of definition can itself just lead to the conclusion that I want. And so by unpacking the idea of free will, I hope to show that Nietzsche was right in presupposing that free will is above all something complicated. So what is free will? Notice how the phrase free will has two components, free and will. Let's start with the will part. The word will in English comes from German. And in German, it literally means to want. Ich will etwas means I want something. Ich will einen Elefanten in der Größe eines Welpen means I want an elephant the size of a puppy. And so the idea of will is tied to desire. If you desire an Egg McMuffin from McDonald's, that's a will. You will an Egg McMuffin. If you want to bench press 300 pounds, that's a kind of will. If you want to become the president, again, that's a will. If you want to become immortal, that's a will. That's a desire. You will to become immortal. If you want to go back in time, well, that's also a will. So you might be annoyed that I just came up with 3 examples to explain something that's rather mundane and obvious. But notice that in each of these examples, the probability of you successfully attaining the thing that you will actually decreases. You want an Egg McMuffin? No problem. Go to McDonald's and order one. You want to bench press 300 pounds? Well, that's a little bit more difficult, and it kind of depends on how much you can already bench press. But also, you need to put in more effort to be able to achieve that. It's more of a long-term goal. And you need to possess more motivation to be able to do it as compared to just ordering an Egg McMuffin. Do you want to become president of your country? Again, it's within possibility, but the odds are stacked against you, especially if you're just some random person. But for someone else in a completely different position, such as Donald Trump, that goal is far more attainable. So pay attention to the fact that the possibility of attaining a thing can vary from person to person. What about becoming immortal? Well, this just seems flat out impossible, but maybe it can be done in theory if you try really, really hard and research so much that maybe you can achieve this, even though it seems really, really difficult. What about traveling backwards in time? As far as I'm aware, this seems literally impossible because you would have to break the laws of physics, and I don't think there's a way to break the laws of physics. I could be wrong, but I think that's a reasonable assumption that breaking the laws of physics is impossible. So it's beyond conceivable how this could even happen. Or maybe it is conceivable, just impossible because we can conceive it and we can see that it's impossible. So notice how there's this subtle gradation between wills that seem attainable and wills that seem unattainable. So imagine if your desire was to go back in time and change the past. Everybody desires this at some point if like a interview doesn't go well or if a date doesn't go well, but it's impossible ostensibly because you can't just break the laws of physics. So then imagine if I were to present this as an argument against free will. You don't have free will because you can't break the laws of physics. Is that a generally applicable or generally valid argument against the notion of free will as it stands? I think that's saying that free will doesn't exist because you can't break the laws of physics to achieve what you will only really applies to certain desires, to certain wills. And so it's not a generally applicable argument against free will. Because if I want an Egg McMuffin, I can just go out and get one. It's not the same kind of restriction on that will as compared to the other will. So my point here is whether or not you can get what you will depends on the will itself, but also on the person doing the willing, which is clear from the situation of becoming the leader of your nation. That's clearly more attainable for some people compared to other people. It's also clear from that example of wanting to bench press 300 pounds. That goal seems far more achievable for somebody who already benches 250 pounds compared to someone who's never bench pressed in their lives. And that goal is just straight up impossible for somebody who doesn't have any arms. So just because you have a will, you have a desire for something, doesn't mean you will necessarily attain that which you will. And it also shows that maybe we aren't all equally free to obtain something. Maybe some of us are more free than others when it comes to obtaining a certain goal or a certain thing. And this actually raises really important questions about whether it's even meaningful to talk about free will as a general concept. Since what you desire, what you will always be something specific, and its attainability will vary depending on what it is you desire and also the person doing the desiring. So in order to incorporate this varying degree of attainability into our definition of free will, we should think about will as a capacity, the potential to achieve what you desire. Furthermore, it's important to clarify that just because you will something doesn't mean it just automatically occurs. It's not like I have a desire and then suddenly a chain of events is set in motion that just causes me to have that thing. Just because you desire something doesn't mean it just happens. You have to take actions in order for that thing to occur. So action is really important here. This means that will represents the ability of individuals to act on their desires and the choice to pursue what one desires through deliberate action. So this idea of action is really important and something we should probably incorporate into our definition of free will. So to summarize, this means that the word will and the phrase free will should have three components: desire, the capacity to pursue that desire, and the course of action you take for that desire to become fulfilled. So in the case of bench pressing 300 pounds, you can imagine, like we did before, somebody who's already experienced with bench pressing and can already bench press 250 pounds compared to somebody who's never bench pressed in their lives. They both have the same desire, but they differ in their capacity to achieve that desire, because presumably the person with more experience will be able to achieve that more easily. And so his capacity or his ability is in a sense greater. So both of them might try to fulfill this desire by taking the necessary actions for that outcome to be fulfilled, but one might have an easier time at it. So the idea of will as a capacity is something which is really important to understand. Because again, you can imagine a person who has no arms at all, their capacity to pursue this is just completely non-existent. So capacity is quantifiable, which means will should also be quantifiable. But that's not the only way in which will can be quantifiable. If we reconsider the idea of a desire, two different people might have the same desire, but they might differ with respect to motivation, how much they're motivated to actually achieve that desire. Because the more motivation you have, the more determined you will be to achieve that goal. So even if the person who has no bench press experience has to do more work to achieve his goal, he might be more motivated to do it, which means he would have a greater willingness to exert more effort in order for that to become his reality. So motivation for any particular desire should also vary in a quantitative way, so that's another reason why will itself should also be quantitative. So both of these facts show that will itself must be quantifiable, because we differ with respect to our capacity to do something, but we also differ with respect to our motivation to do it. High motivation and high capacity means that whatever it is you will is more likely to be achieved. Low motivation and low capacity reduces the likelihood of you achieving whatever it is. We also really need to pay attention to what it is that we're willing. We can't just speak about free will in general. We can only speak about it with respect to what it is that one desires. This means that free will has a kind of context sensitivity. So abstracting free will as a general principle might not be valid or might not produce valid results or valid philosophical conclusions. And it's also important to realize this because what one desires varies with respect to possibility. Becoming president is extremely unlikely if you're just an ordinary person, but still technically possible. Whereas traveling backwards in time, it just seems impossible. So would it be accurate to say that in either case you have no free will? Obviously, there's something different about these cases, which I don't often see conceptualized in discussions of free will. Okay, so let's write down our definition of will. Will is the capacity of a person to act on their desires. So this definition encompasses ability, it encompasses desires, and it encompasses actions. The three fundamental components of willing. Now, if you disagree with this definition of will, please let me know. And please try to substitute a better definition. What I'm really hoping for is that by being super autistic and super pedantic about this, is that I've produced a definition of the word will, which is what people mean most of the time when they express the word. And you can be the one to decide that. If you disagree, please let me know. I'd really like to know. So now that we've established what a will is, we need to discuss what it means for a will to be free. So let's think of freedom as it's ordinarily thought of. Freedom in the ordinary sense also kind of refers to the ability to do something. And it's usually attached to social or legal connotations. For example, the idea of free speech. If I have free speech, it means I have the right to say whatever I want without being impeded. So for example, I can say Prime Minister Justin Trudeau likes to dress up as Fat Albert and say, hey, 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 at Halloween parties. And I am free to say that. Not having free speech would mean that there's a penalty for criticizing my dear leader. And so in that case, something would impede me from saying that Justin Trudeau likes to torture raccoons with a waffle iron. I'm sure generative AI will do a great job of depicting that. So in a general sense, I am not free if something prevents me from carrying out the actions which will lead to whatever it is I desire being obtained. But whenever you will anything, there's going to be some barrier to it. So for example, right now, if I want a piece of chocolate, I can just go get one. That's easily attainable, but there are barriers. My pantry is about 30 feet from where I'm standing, and that distance itself is a kind of barrier. But it's a barrier that I can overcome if I have the capacity to overcome it, and if I have enough effort to overcome it. On the other side of things, the laws of physics themselves are unbreakable, and so they represent this insurmountable obstacle should I desire something which necessitates breaking the laws of physics. And so in a sense, I'm not free to just do that. What about something like becoming the president? So obviously, if you're just an average person, there's going to be a huge number of barriers that prevent you from achieving that. So are you free to achieve that? Well, you're certainly free to try to become president, but it seems like with all of these barriers in the way, the chance of it actually becoming reality is extremely low. So there's a good chance that no matter what your capability is, or no matter how determined you are, it just won't happen. But just because the odds are low doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to influence the odds in your favor. You can alter the probability of it becoming reality. So for example, the first step to becoming president is to fill out the necessary paperwork. And if somebody is not motivated to just do that simple step, their chances of becoming president are just zero. But if somebody is motivated to fill out the proper paperwork, the odds have increased ever so slightly in their favor. So maybe free will is ultimately about manipulating probabilities in your favor, so that even if there are barriers between you and what it is you desire, you can alter fate such that the probability of that thing occurring has increased in your favor. So what I think that all of this implies is that a will, i.e. a capacity to fulfill a desire, has freedom if it is capable of overcoming any barriers to the fulfillment of that goal. But what else do people commonly mean by the word free in free will? Well, this often means not determined by prior causes. So what does it mean for a will to not be determined by prior causes? This would mean that the will itself would have had to have spontaneously originated out of nothing, without being caused by or influenced by anything else. Or it means that the person themselves must have been responsible for originating the will. So, for example, imagine I'm watching TV and I see a commercial. Actually, I haven't watched TV that has commercials in a really long time, but imagine that I was, and a commercial came up for an Egg McMuffin. And then suddenly I just have this craving for one because the ad just looks so good. It makes it look so delicious. So that desire, that will, came from something external to me. It came from a commercial. The commercial implanted that will into my psyche. So it wasn't really free according to this idea, right? But I don't think that the idea of being undetermined by prior causes actually constitutes the definition of free. All it does is explain the origins of a particular will. It doesn't make any statement about whether that will is free or not. It just says where it came from. Yes, something external was responsible for my desire to go and get an Egg McMuffin, but is that will, is that desire or that capacity to fulfill that desire free or not? Yes, it is free, because it can freely seize control of my body and force my body to go to McDonald's in order to get what it wants. It can seize my body and direct it towards fulfillment of its desires. And yes, there might be impediments on the way to me fulfilling that desire, but I'm free if I have the ability to overcome those impediments. And so such impediments might reduce my freedom, or the freedom of that will, but the will is still fundamentally free. That will did indeed come from something external, but I have to be an active agent in bringing that desire forth. If I right now desire something, I have to be an active agent in bringing forth a future in which I possess that thing. It didn't just happen because I saw a commercial. It's not just like the photons of light from the commercial hit my eyes and then caused this chain reaction that just caused me to just go to McDonald's and buy something. I have to exert will in order for that to happen. It doesn't just happen automatically. It happens because that will decides to freely act in accordance with its desires. And that will is a part of me. It's a part of my psyche. And I think that the absurdity of claiming that something isn't free because it was caused by something in the past is pretty clear when we talk about freedom in a more general sense. Because imagine if you asked me, hey, do you have freedom of speech in your country? And I said, well, no, because my desire to call Justin Trudeau an unethical puppy mill breeder happened after I watched one of his speeches in Parliament. Clearly explaining where my desire to say something came from doesn't make any statement about whether or not I'm free to say it. The answer of whether or not I have freedom of speech is yes, I'm free to say whatever I want, because nothing impedes me from saying that. It's not like the government will arrest me for saying what I just said, at least not currently. If I don't have freedom of speech, what it implies is that there's something stopping me from speaking freely. It doesn't imply that something in the past caused my ability to speak or my desire to speak. It just implies that something stops me from moving forward with speaking. So in a similar way, just pointing to causal determinism doesn't make any statement about freedom or lack of freedom. It just explains the origins of a will. This logic even works when you think about decision making, because oftentimes you'll hear free will in the context of making a decision. So for example, you have to pick between two alternatives. For example, you have to pick either chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream. So let's say you're presented with this choice and you're unfree to pick both of them due to financial constraints. So that's an example of an impediment, but forget about that for a second. So you have to think to yourself, which of these do I desire more? Maybe you desire both, and ideally you would like to have both, but you ultimately pick the chocolate because in that moment, or because of something, maybe you saw the chocolate, the pictures on the chocolate ice cream tub, and that compelled you to want chocolate, to desire it more. So maybe in that moment you just have the desire you have the craving for chocolate more than you have the craving for vanilla. But in a sense, you didn't choose to want chocolate more. It was just kind of a fact. Like, that was just the state of your psyche in that moment. It was just predisposed to want chocolate more in that moment. And so sometimes people say that this implies that you weren't free, right? Well, what exactly wasn't free? Your desire to have chocolate is a part of you. It's a part of your mind. And it was freely able to pick what it desired. And again, it's not as if the chocolate caused you to buy the chocolate. You had to take the actions necessary for that future, the future in which you have chocolate ice cream in your freezer. You had to take actions for that to come forth. So your desire to have chocolate should be thought of as a part of you. And you did have the freedom to choose chocolate in that situation, right? Nothing really stopped you from exerting that freedom. Something that would impede you would be something like if you went there intending to buy chocolate and there was none available. That would be an impediment. So now the future in which you have chocolate ice cream is less likely. But if you can go to another store and get the chocolate ice cream, even if it's out of the way, if you have the motivation to do that, you have the freedom to do that. You're free to do it because you've overcome the impediments to you manifesting that particular future. Now, you might be unsatisfied with my objections to determinism so far, because determinism is very often painted as like the opposite of free will, and you might have heard other arguments that show that determinism contradicts the idea of free will. But what I'm going to say to that now is, in the future, I'm going to dedicate an entire video to breaking down the idea of determinism and arguing why, in my opinion, determinism doesn't actually show that free will doesn't exist. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. Determinism shows that free will must exist. So again, if you're unsatisfied with what I've said so far, just wait for that video and I promise I'll break it down in more detail. So now I'm going to put forth the definition of free will, which I promised you. Free will is the capacity to act towards the fulfillment of one's desires by overcoming any barriers to said desire. So this implies that free will is an amount that can vary. If you don't have sufficient free will, you will not be able to attain what it is that your will desires. Free will also appears to be situationally dependent. It depends on what you desire. And it depends on who you are as a person, the current state of your body and mind, as well as your motivation and your abilities. And this definition also encompasses the fact that your freedom will be limited if you can't proceed because there are barriers in the way. So with this definition established, and again, let me know if you agree or disagree with the definition. In the next video, I'm going to break down something which I rarely ever hear people talk about when they discuss free will. And I'm going to try to derive a very useful axiom or assumption, which we're going to be using as we proceed through our argument of free will. And this thing that I don't see discussed very often is the fact that the claim is you have free will or you don't have free will. But what exactly are you? You are not at all a clearly delineated object. And so we will actually need some time to break down the idea of you, the idea of the self. Because again, this is a very crucial component in deciding whether free will exists or not, or whether you have free will. We need to know what it is we're actually attributing free will to. What possesses free will? Because if you poorly define this concept, you can get to the conclusion that you don't have free will. But if you more rigorously define it, you will be able to see why an argument exists for the existence of free will. So yeah, in the next video, I'm going to be discussing who you are. Who are you? You specifically. But for now, I'm going to go get an Egg McMuffin because it's still breakfast time and they should be available. But yeah, take care, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.